For Conversations with Great Minds, I speak with an American historian, economist, and author who's opened our eyes to some fascinating insights into how generations of people interact with each other to craft the timeline of modern human history. He's written more than a dozen books, one of which, The Fourth Turning, written back in 1997, or published then, probably written before then, was prophetic in describing the events we're facing today as a nation. His most recent book is called Millennials in the Workplace. Currently, he's the president of the consulting firm Life Course Associates, senior associate for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Global Aging Initiative. I'd like to welcome now to the studio Neil Howe. Neil, thanks for showing up tonight.
Tom, it's great to be here.
Welcome to our program. I have, among my 10 or 15 most influential books is your Fourth Turning and the books that surround it. I think the whole concept of multi-generational, well, I lack the words. If you could describe for us the concept, why the Fourth Turning? What are the four generations? What's the big concept behind
What is this all about anyway? It really started with our first book, Generations, which came out in 1991, several years earlier. That's kind of what gave birth to this whole new approach. We decided, this is Bill Strauss and myself, we decided to write a history of America the way it had never been written before. And that is as a sequence of generational biographies, starting all the way back in the early 1600s with the first generation, you know, the Great Migration to New England with John Winthrop and the Puritans and so on. And we looked at each generation as a separate collective story. What were they like as children? What was going on? What shaped them coming of age? Their courtship? What wars did they serve in? Did they experience parenting? What were they like as midlife leaders? And what were they like in old age? How did they look back upon their lives and their life lessons? And then we'd take the next group and the next group. And what the first thing we found that was interesting is these different generations would experience the same events, but they'd experience them at different ages, which gave them a completely different outlook. One generation, of course, served in the war. The next generation were the children during the war and drew very different lessons from the experience. And
another generation were the elders during the war.
Right, with the leaders and then the elders. And these kinds of generational differences have been around for centuries. They've always been there, and they've been talked about. The next thing we found that was really sort of unexpected is not only are these generations all very different, but they tend to recur in a certain rhythm. That is to say, certain kinds of generations tend to follow other generations. And of course, since each generation both is shaped by history and then shapes history, right? It shapes history as midlife leaders and parents, that there is a kind of a rhythm in the kinds of generations actually implied a rhythm of history itself. And that gave rise to a perspective which stood at the front of our third book, which was The Fourth Turning, which was instead of looking at generations and then looking at the rhythm of history, we started by looking at rhythms of history. What are the patterns of history? Why are there cycles of war? Are they cycles of religious awakening? Does drug use rise or fall in any predictable pattern? Is there such a thing as a long cycle, a Kondratiev wave in economic activity? Are there such things as a cycle of realigning elections in American history? These have been widely discussed. There's an enormous literature on looking at these kinds of rhythms and cycles.
Particularly the economics of it.
Particularly the economics. And we found that there are cycles, and in fact, the generational experience is the guiding or governing a timer of these cycles, and it kind of gives rise, it gives coherence. The experience of being young and growing older is a constant throughout history. It really doesn't vary very much. I mean, it's true that some of us live longer than we used to, but the basic phases of life, being a young person, coming of age into adulthood, achieving leadership responsibilities, usually in your mid-40s, and then beginning to retire from public life and economic life in your mid-60s, late 60s, these have been constants. And they do give a certain timing to history itself.
So my read of your book was that there are these four kind of archetypal generations that in that, and each generation is roughly 20 years.
Right.
Jefferson defined them as 19 years,
right.
Let's say 20. And so every 80 years, the cycle repeats itself, and each one of those four generations, because of their experience, from the generation that experiences war and depression, because of their experience, because of their children's experience growing up in that, they become the generation that does, let's start with that, a generation that experiences war and depression, or depression and war. That generation is called what?
Well, the generation...
To pick an arbitrary point.
A generation that comes of age in their youth, participating actively in a period of national crisis like a war, we call them a civic generation, or the hero archetype.
Right. This is the founders?
These would be the Republican generation, often, you know, the res publica generation, the original meaning of Republican,
right.
Of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. I mean, precocious, young as political leaders, an incredible age. I think the average age of the writers, authors of the Federalist Papers, right? Jay, Hamilton, and Madison, something like 30 years old.
That's right.
I mean, imagine today the founding document of a whole new political regime being written by people that young. But that's what we expected from that generation.
So then that generation...
then
gives birth to...
they grew old. And typical of a hero archetype, and we've seen many of them in our history, they become politically and institutionally powerful at a young age, and they occupy these positions of public leadership for a long tenure over their lifetime. They're powerful as voters. They organize. They vote frequently. They vote often, and they vote in an organized way. The most recent example of a hero archetype, of course, is the greatest generation, right? The GI generation, who came of age during the Great Depression, came of age in World War II. They are the most uniformed generation per capita in American history, right?
Wow. Something
Something like 15 million of them served in World War II. Yeah. They took us out of the Great Depression. They fought these wars. They built the interstates and the miracle vaccines. They took us to the moon, the Great Society, all these wonderful civic things. They have voted, you know, our whole image now of old people is they vote all the time, right? Mm-hmm. Well, old people in American history don't always vote all the time. It's just this generation that voted.
So then the civic generation gives birth to...
Well, they are then followed, and this sometimes is their younger siblings, sometimes their children, but they are followed by what we call the artist archetype. And these are the war children. These are the children of war, born just too young, just too late to participate.
We have a chart of this
in the war, and just too early to, but early enough to actually experience the crisis.
Here's the turnings in history.
There we go, and you can see how they're all located. These tend to be conformist generations young. We've seen many of them.
This is the 50s in the United States.
This was the 50s, and this was the so-called silent generation, who were named by the historian William Manchester in Time magazine in the early 1950s, silent. They, our image of silent generation's children would be the Little Rascals, Shirley Temple, very well-behaved kids in a tight envelope.
That Richard Nixon tried to reach out to politically when he said, I wanted to talk to the silent majority.
And he was successful for a time, as we remember. They, and a new generation always surprises people. Okay, that's the rule. It always comes because we're never expecting this sudden shift in youth behavior. And the silent generation surprised everyone because when they came to college right after World War II, their motto was no longer, we want to change the system, join the Communist Party, conquer half the world, you know, the big things the GIs want to do. Their motto was, we don't want to change the system, we want to work within the system. And Fortune magazine had a cover story in 1949 called The College Class of 49, and the subtitle was Taking No Chances.
Wow.
Their first interviews for jobs was about pension plans, right?
So this generation, we have about 4 minutes here left until the break, and I'd like to get through all four of them here. So that generation, that silent generation, then gives birth to, or is followed by? Is
followed by the prophet archetype. And of course, very recently in American history, these are boomers. We've seen this pattern again and again in American history. The generation born after the Great Crisis with no memory of it, indulgently raised at a time of high material affluence, They come of age, triggering the next great religious or cultural
This is Henry
awakening.
David Thoreau, Ralph
Exactly.
Waldo Emerson, and this is the hippies.
This is the hippies.
Taking LSD.
This is the consciousness
Maharishi.
revolution. They come of age attacking the institution of their elders. They reshape not the outer world of institutions, they reshape the world of culture, values, and religion. And they spend the rest of their life as culture warriors.
Right.
I mean, come on, this is red zone, blue
right and
zone
the left.
America. This is the boomers.
Yeah.
And the boomers are in turn followed by the generation who are children during the awakening. These are the little kids when older people are discovering themselves and having visions of the new truth, getting in touch with themselves. These are usually, unlike the silent generation, which are overprotected, this archetype that we call the nomad archetype is underprotected. And this is Generation X.
Right.
We see the same pattern, and we see again and again. These are a generation of realists.
And this is the
survivors, free agents.
And this would be also the Calvin Coolidge, Warren Harding, that era.
The lost they were later called the lost generation.
Whose excesses, whose financial excesses in seeking wealth and material prosperity led to the Great Depression and World War II. So the cycle starts all over again.
Exactly. It first gave rise to the Roaring '20s, and then to the Great. It was Generation X, along with boomers, who gave rise to the Roaring '90s.
Right.
And then the OOs, right? And then finally, look, we have a meltdown, we have the bursting of bubbles, and we're living through the aftermath of that today.
And these four generations recur, and you take this all the way back to the War of the Roses.
We take it back actually to the Renaissance, and we believe it not only occurs in sort of American Anglo history, it occurs in other societies as well. In fact, we can talk about that later, but you go across the world today, and you notice globally many of the same kinds of generational types emerging throughout not just the English-speaking world, but all of Europe, including Russia, and in China. China is obsessed with generations. We should talk about that because it's a fascinating story.
But they're emerging at different times.
Slightly different times, but in these particular areas, there's actually a rough correspondence. A little bit later in these other countries than in America, but a rough correspondence. It's fascinating.
It's absolutely remarkable. Now, you wrote this book was published in '97, the fourth
1997.
So you probably wrote this in '95, '96.
We wrote it in '95, '96. It's a book, of course, as you know. In the book, we predicted.
Well, that's what I wanted to read. If just as a setup for the next segment, because we've got about a minute here into the break, and so I'd like to just share this with our viewers, because I remember reading this and thinking, well, we'll see. And now looking back on it, it blows my mind. You wrote back in 1995, the next fourth turning is due to begin shortly after the new millennium. After the year 2005, a sudden spark will catalyze a crisis mood. Remnants of the old social order will disintegrate. Political and economic trust will implode. Real hardship will beset the land with severe distress that could involve questions of class, race, nation, and empire. Yet this time of trouble will bring seeds of social rebirth, you wrote. Americans will share a regret about recent mistakes and a resolute new consensus about what to do. And the very survival of the nation will feel at stake. Sometime before the year 2025, America will pass through a great gate in history commensurate with the American Revolution, the Civil War, the twin emergencies of the Great Depression and World War II. The risk of catastrophe will be very high. The nation could erupt into insurrection or civil violence, crack up geographically, or succumb to authoritarian rule if there's a war. It is likely to be one of maximum risk and efforts. In other words, a total war. Now, this just is incredible. When we come back, Neil,
on the other hand, it could have a very positive. I mean, it could solve all of our world problems. This is the lesson of fourth turning. So
yes, and I want to get into that. How did you see this coming, and where are we now, and where do we go? We'll be right back here with Neil Howe in our Conversations with Great Minds.